There is one small detail in the Nolan Wells investigation that keeps getting buried beneath the louder arguments. People have been talking about the enhanced audio. They have been trying to identify voices in the background. They have been debating whether certain words sound like Nolan, whether another phrase sounds like, "Is he dead?" and whether the recording contains something investigators should be paying closer attention to. But before we get to any enhanced version of that recording, there is something much simpler. It is in the original call, and it matters because of what the caller told the CTO dispatcher about the people on that boat. Before we get into the details, if you've been following the Nolan Wells case, and you appreciate taking the time to separate what we know from what we're still trying to understand, consider subscribing to Hidden Motive. We don't rush these stories. We take our time, look at the available evidence, and follow the developments as they happen. And if you've already been here for the earlier Nolan Wells updates, thank you for coming back. Stay with me, because there are some details in this story that deserve a closer look. On July 4th, 2026, sometime around 4 p.m., a teenager aboard a boat near the west tip of Horn Island called CTO for help. The caller said the boat's bilge pump had stopped working. Water was coming in, and the boat was taking on water. The caller was worried, but then the dispatcher asked a very ordinary question. Was everyone on board? The answer, according to the released recording, was yes. And that is where the story becomes much more complicated. Because Nolan Wells was supposed to be on that boat. Or, at least, that is the question investigators and the public have been trying to settle ever since. Nolan was 18 years old, a college football player from Mississippi, and on the 4th of July he had gone to Horn Island with friends for a day on the water. Horn Island is a barrier island off Mississippi's Gulf Coast. It is not the kind of place where you simply walk down a street and find a police station, a convenience store, or a waiting taxi. It is surrounded by water, and conditions in the area can become dangerous. That afternoon, something happened that would eventually become one of the most important pieces of the timeline. A boat associated with the group began experiencing trouble. The CTO call was placed, and the caller said they were sinking. The recording is not a polished conversation. There is music, there is background noise, there is the sound of people moving around and talking. The caller sounds hurried. The basic exchange is remarkably clear. The caller told the dispatcher, "We're at the west tip of Horn," and explained that the bilge pump had stopped working. Then came the words that have now been replayed thousands of times online. "We're sinking. Can y'all please come?" The dispatcher asked how high the water was. The caller answered that the water was coming up and that they were going down. Then came the question that deserves more attention than it has received. The dispatcher asked whether everyone on board was okay. The caller answered that everyone was on board and in good health. Now, let's slow down here, because it would be very easy to take that one sentence and turn it into something it does not prove. The recording does not identify every person by name. It does not establish that Nolan Wells was physically on the boat at that exact moment, and it does not, by itself, prove that anybody lied. Those are important distinctions, but the timing of the call makes the statement significant. Nolan would disappear later that same day. His body would be found on July 6th. And according to the account publicly given by friends, Nolan had remained behind on Horn Island after the group left. That explanation has been questioned by his family, particularly because Nolan's phone was reportedly left behind as well. His parents have wanted investigators to establish exactly what happened between the time the group separated and the time Nolan was eventually found. So imagine the scene for a moment. It is July 4. The island is busy with people celebrating the holiday. There are boats around the area. Music is playing. A group of young people is dealing with a boat that is taking on water. Someone reaches for a phone and calls CTO. A dispatcher begins asking routine safety questions. Where are you? What is wrong? How much water is coming into the boat? Are the people aboard safe? And the answer comes back that everyone is there and everyone is okay. Then, according to the released dispatch record, the situation changes. The CTO captain is told that the people aboard have resolved the problem and no longer need assistance. That is another part of the call that deserves attention. The emergency does not end with a dramatic rescue. The people on the boat apparently get the situation under control. The assistance is canceled. and the boat eventually makes its way away from the island. But Nolan does not return with them. That is the basic conflict at the heart of this entire story. The call tells us something about the boat. The later accounts tell us something about Nolan. The challenge is figuring out how those two pieces fit together. And right now, there are still gaps. Records and reporting indicate that Nolan was later believed to have remained on the island, reportedly after staying behind with a young woman. One of his friends, Warren Hudson, has publicly described the group urging Nolan to leave, while other details about what Nolan intended to do next remain disputed or unclear. That means the most important question may not actually be, what can we hear in the background of the recording? The more basic question is, who was actually on that boat when the caller said everyone was on board? That is something a forensic examination of the audio could potentially help clarify, but only if investigators have the original recording, the full dispatch records, and enough information to identify the voices. And that is precisely why Nolan's family has now taken the audio seriously. On July 30th, attorneys for the family said they had hired audio engineers to review the distress call. The recording had already become the subject of intense online speculation, particularly after people began claiming that faint background voices could be heard after the dispatcher began speaking with the caller. One audio engineer, Janetta Brantley, independently worked on the recording using traditional audio restoration techniques. She said she avoided AI voice separation because aggressive enhancement can introduce artifacts and make uncertain sounds appear clearer than they really are. That caution is important. Anyone who has ever tried to understand an old cassette tape, a distant telephone conversation, or a recording made in a noisy room knows how quickly a person's brain can fill in missing words. Once someone tells you, "Listen closely," that person says Nolan, you may hear Nolan. Another person may hear something completely different. That is why a professional forensic examination is different from a viral social media clip. The original recording matters. The original file matters. The timing matters. And the identity of each speaker matters. Without those things, an enhanced clip can raise questions, but it cannot answer them. There is another reason this distinction matters. The independent autopsy commissioned by Nolan's family did not establish a cause or manner of death. Forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell reported that both remained undetermined pending further investigation. The examination noted an area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head, but the report could not establish that the discoloration came from blunt force trauma. The body had also undergone significant decomposition, making some conclusions more difficult. So, as of now, the autopsy does not prove that Nolan was murdered. It does not prove that he drowned either. And the distress call does not prove that Nolan was on the boat. Those facts have to remain separate. But when you put the timeline together, you can understand why the call has become so important. An 18-year-old goes to Horn Island with friends. A boat later reports an emergency. The caller says everyone aboard is okay. The boat's emergency is apparently resolved. The group returns. Nolan does not. 2 days later, his body is found near the island. That sequence alone does not tell us what happened to him. But it tells us exactly where investigators need to look. Not just at the loudest sound in the recording, not just at a word that someone online believes they heard. The real value may be in the quieter details. Who was speaking? Who was standing nearby? When was the call made? Who knew the boat was in trouble? Who canceled the sea tow response? And most importantly, what was happening on that boat at the precise moment the caller said everyone was accounted for? There is a temptation, whenever a case becomes heavily discussed online, to search for one sentence that solves everything. Real investigations rarely work that way. Sometimes the most important piece is a sentence that sounds completely ordinary. Sometimes it is a phone record. Sometimes it is a timestamp. And sometimes it is a question asked by a dispatcher who had no idea that the call would eventually become part of a death investigation. In the Nolan Wells case, that ordinary question was whether everyone on board was safe. The answer was yes. But Nolan Wells was later found dead on the island. And until investigators can establish exactly who was where during those critical hours of July 4th, that simple answer remains one of the details worth examining very carefully. Because the question is no longer simply what people think they hear in the background. The question is whether the complete timeline of the call matches the story that came afterward. Before we move into the next part, I'd like to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? And more importantly, after everything we've covered so far, what detail about Nolan's final known movements stands out to you the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and please keep the conversation respectful. Behind every headline is a family still waiting for answers. That brings us back to the call. Because once you listen to it as part of the timeline, rather than as a mysterious piece of audio by itself, a different set of questions begins to emerge. The first thing to remember is that the recording was not made for a future criminal investigation. The person on the other end of the phone was a sea-tow dispatcher. The caller wanted a boat problem fixed. The concern was water. The bilge pump was not working. The boat was taking on water. That was the emergency. Nobody on that call could have known that 2 days later, Nolan Wells would be found dead near Horn Island. And that is important because the conversation is relatively ordinary. There is no dramatic confession. There is no obvious threat. There is no moment where somebody announces that Nolan has disappeared. Instead, there are people trying to solve what sounds like a boating problem. The caller gives the dispatcher the location. The dispatcher asks questions. The caller tries to provide information. And then the conversation moves toward the number of people on the boat. That part has become particularly important because public accounts indicate that approximately 7 people were aboard. The released material supports the fact that the caller reported everyone aboard was okay. But there is a distinction here that is easy to miss. Everyone is okay is not necessarily the same thing as Nolan Wells is on this boat. Those are two different statements. And unless the original recording identifies the passengers individually, we cannot simply fill in that blank ourselves. This is where online discussions can become dangerous. A person hears a voice. Someone else says the voice sounds like Nolan. Another person says it sounds like somebody else. A short clip is uploaded. Then another account enhances it. Then someone adds captions. Within hours, an uncertain sound can begin circulating as though it were an established fact. But investigators do not get to work that way. They have to ask what can actually be demonstrated. That is why the original audio is so important. And there is another detail that deserves attention. The recording has been described as involving a call made at approximately 4 p.m. on July 4th. Some public labels give slightly different times, and the exact original machine metadata has not been publicly authenticated. That may sound like a tiny technical issue. It is not. In a case where the critical window is measured in hours, even a difference in the recorded time can matter. Think about the timeline investigators are trying to reconstruct. Nolan arrives at Horn Island with friends. At some point, the group prepares to leave. A boat carrying members of the group encounters trouble. Someone calls sea-tow. The dispatcher records the emergency. The boat eventually no longer needs assistance. And Nolan is not on the mainland when the others return. The next 2 days are then spent searching for him. On July 6th, Nolan's body is found near Horn Island. That leaves a critical period between the boat call and Nolan's disappearance. And that is where witnesses become especially important. What did each person remember? When did they last see Nolan? Where was he standing? Who spoke with him? What did he say? And what time did each person believe they left? Those questions may sound repetitive, but that is how timelines are tested. One witness might remember an event occurring before another event. A phone record might show something happened later. A GPS record might place a device somewhere unexpected. A photograph might establish that a person was still present at a particular time. One small inconsistency may be meaningless. Several independent inconsistencies can be much more significant. That is why the call cannot be examined separately from the rest of the evidence. And this brings us to another issue that has received considerable attention. What happened to Nolan's phone? His family has raised concerns about messages and photographs that were reportedly deleted from the device. They have sought additional digital information, including social media and location data, as they try to establish what happened during the missing hours. Again, we have to be careful. Deleted information does not automatically mean somebody committed a crime. Phones delete things. People delete things. Applications synchronize. Cloud services can change what appears on a device, and investigators have to determine whether the deletion was intentional, accidental, automatic or unrelated. But if the phone contains information that can establish Nolan's location, then that information could become extremely valuable. Because a phone can sometimes answer a question that memory cannot. Where was the device? When was it moving? Which tower handled the signal? Was a message sent? Was an application opened? Was the phone connected to a particular network? And perhaps most importantly, what happened immediately before the device was left behind? Those details could help investigators compare the digital timeline with the statements of the people who were there. Now, consider the CTO call from that perspective. It becomes a timestamp. Not necessarily a timestamp that solves the case, but a timestamp that can be compared with everything else. If the call occurred around 4 p.m., investigators can ask where each person was around 3:45. Where were they at 4:05? What happened at 4:15? When did the boat leave? When did Nolan last communicate with anyone? When was his phone last active? When did the other members of the group reach the mainland? The more independent records investigators can line up, the smaller the gap becomes. And sometimes that is how an investigation moves forward. Not with one spectacular discovery, with several ordinary records that finally agree with one another. But there is another reason the call has drawn attention. It contains background sound. People are talking. There is music and noise. And because the recording is relatively chaotic, listeners have attempted to isolate individual voices. Some have described hearing words or phrases that they believe may be relevant to Nolan's disappearance. This is where the recent professional audio work becomes important. According to reporting, the Wells family hired audio specialists to examine the recording, and audio engineer Janetta Brantley has discussed the difficulty of working with a recording like this. She emphasized the danger of using aggressive enhancement techniques that can create artifacts or make ambiguous sounds seem more definite than they really are. That point deserves to be repeated. Enhancement does not magically recover words that were never recorded clearly. It can reduce noise. It can separate frequencies. It can make certain portions easier to hear, but it cannot turn an unintelligible whisper into a perfectly reliable sentence. That is why a responsible analysis should distinguish between three things: what the original recording clearly contains, what enhancement makes easier to hear, and what a listener believes the sound means. Those are not necessarily the same. For a case like this, that distinction could protect the investigation from going down the wrong path. Imagine, for example, that thousands of people become convinced that a background voice says Nolan's name. If forensic analysis later determines that the sound was actually something else, investigators have lost time. But if the recording contains a genuinely identifiable voice or a meaningful statement, then that could be different. It could provide a new lead. And that is why the call deserves to be examined without either extreme. It should not be dismissed simply because people online are discussing it. But it should not be treated as proof of murder simply because an enhanced clip sounds frightening. There is another major piece of the story that has to be kept in view: the independent autopsy. Nolan's family commissioned an independent examination after his body was recovered. The preliminary findings were released publicly in July. The pathologist, Dr. Roger Mitchell, concluded that the cause and manner of death were undetermined, pending further investigation. The report did not establish a homicide. It also did not conclusively establish drowning. The examination was complicated by decomposition. The report described an area of red discoloration in tissue at the back of Nolan's head, but the significance of that finding could not be established from the examination alone. That means the medical evidence has not provided the definitive answer people online have been searching for, and that matters when we return to the call. Because if the cause of death remains undetermined, then the timeline becomes even more important. If Nolan drowned, investigators still need to determine how he entered the water. If he died from another cause, they need to establish when and where that happened. If another person was involved, they need evidence showing that. And if there was no foul play, investigators still need to explain the circumstances that led an 18-year-old to remain on an island while the others left. At the moment, the public does not have enough evidence to answer all of those questions. Authorities have not publicly identified a suspect, and reporting continues to describe the investigation as ongoing. That is why one of the most interesting developments now is not simply another internet theory. It is the effort to reconstruct the physical location itself. As of August 6th, Nolan's friends Warren Hudson, Jax Pitalo, and Morgan Seymour, accompanied by their attorneys, were reported to be preparing to return to Horn Island to examine the area where Nolan was last seen alive. Their attorneys said the purpose was to understand the geography and layout, not to collect evidence. That detail may seem unusual, but anyone who has ever tried to reconstruct an event from a written description understands why geography matters. An island can look completely different on a map than it does when you are standing there. A distance that looks short may be difficult to cross. A particular shoreline may be hidden from another location. A boat may appear close to land, but actually be separated by difficult water. And sounds carry differently over open water. So the physical setting can help investigators test people's accounts. Where was Nolan? Where was the boat? What could one person see from another location? How long would it take to walk from one point to another? And if somebody says they saw Nolan at a certain place, does that account make sense when you stand there yourself? Those are practical questions. They are not internet theories, and they may eventually help investigators understand the most important missing stretch of time. Because the CTO call gives us one piece. The phone gives us another. Witness statements give us another. The autopsy gives us another. The island itself gives us another. The challenge is connecting them without forcing the evidence to say something it does not say. And there is one detail about the call that may ultimately matter more than any mysterious background voice. It is not what the dispatcher heard. It is what the caller believed was happening at that exact moment. The caller said the boat was taking on water. The caller asked for help. The caller said the people aboard were okay. And then, shortly afterward, the assistance was canceled. That sequence is documented. What remains unclear is how that sequence fits into Nolan Wells' final hours. And until that timeline is fully reconstructed, the call remains more than just a recording people can argue about online. It is one of the fixed points investigators can use to measure everything else against. Because sometimes the most revealing detail in a complicated case is not hidden inside the loudest moment. Sometimes it is the ordinary statement that nobody thought would matter. And in Nolan Wells's case, that statement may be the one about who was on that boat. We've covered quite a bit so far, and I'm curious what you think. At this point in the investigation, what do you believe deserves the most attention? The audio, the timeline, the witness accounts, or the forensic evidence? There may be details that one person notices, while another person misses them completely. So, share your thoughts below. And if you've been following this case from the beginning, tell us where you're watching from. It's always remarkable to see how many people are following Nolan's story from different parts of the country and around the world. And that brings us back to the detail in the call that has received so much attention. The question is not simply what people believe they hear in the background. The more important question is whether the recording fits the established timeline of Nolan Wells' final hours. If the audio can reliably identify a voice, establish a statement, or clarify who was present, it could become an important piece of the investigation. But if the professional analysis determines that the sounds are too unclear to identify, that matters too, because an investigation has to separate evidence from interpretation. Right now, several things remain unresolved. The final state autopsy findings have not been publicly released. The independent autopsy commissioned by Nolan's family did not establish a cause or manner of death. The circumstances surrounding Nolan's decision to remain on Horn Island remain disputed. And the CTO recording is still being examined for information that could help investigators understand exactly what was happening aboard that boat. That means the answer may not come from one recording. It may come from the way several pieces of evidence fit together. The phone records, the original photographs and videos, the witness statements, the boat's movements, the CTO call, the medical findings, and the physical geography of Horn Island itself. Each piece may answer one small question. Together, they may eventually answer the larger one. What happened to Nolan Wells after his friends left the island? For his family, that question is about much more than a timeline. It is about an 18-year-old who went to the coast with friends on a holiday weekend and never came home. For everyone following the case, it is a reminder that an investigation can look very different from the version presented through short clips and social media posts. A sound can be interesting without being proof. A suspicious detail can deserve investigation without proving a crime, and an unanswered question should remain an unanswered question until the evidence provides an answer. That is particularly important here because the official investigation is still active. As new forensic information becomes available, some of the theories surrounding Nolan's death may be supported. Others may be ruled out, and some questions may remain unanswered for much longer. But for now, that sea-tow call remains one of the clearest windows into what was happening during those critical hours. A boat was taking on water. Someone called for help. The dispatcher asked whether everyone was okay. The answer was yes. And later, Nolan Wells was missing. That simple sequence is why the call deserves another careful look. Not because it automatically proves what happened, but because it gives investigators a moment in time that can be compared with everything else. And perhaps that is the detail people have been missing. The real question is not what the internet wants the recording to say, it is what the recording can actually prove. So I want to ask you, after hearing the timeline and understanding what the sea-tow call actually establishes, do you think the recording deserves more forensic examination, or do you believe the biggest answers will ultimately come from the phone records, witnesses, and final autopsy? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you have been following the Nolan Wells investigation with us, consider subscribing to Hidden Motive. We will continue following the verified developments and separating what investigators have actually established from what is still speculation. Because in a case with this many unanswered questions, sometimes the smallest detail is the one worth listening to twice. Before you leave, I want to ask you one final question. After everything we've examined today, do you believe the detail we've discussed brings us closer to understanding what happened to Nolan Wells, or do you think there are still more important questions investigators need to answer? Let me know what you think in the comments. Take a moment to read some of the other responses too, because many of you have been following this case closely and offering thoughtful perspectives. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to Hidden Motive. Our goal is simple: to slow these stories down, examine the available evidence, and follow the case as new, verified information becomes available. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. And as always, we'll continue following the Nolan Wells investigation and bring you the important developments as they emerge.